Hi, this is Raj from MR Sportscars. In this episode of Diary of a Porsche Specialist, I'm going to be talking about and driving the 991 series Carrera 2S and comparing it to the 997 Carrera 4S. Now, I know one's two-wheel drive, one's four-wheel drive, but essentially the platform that they're both based on are the same as their equivalent. So for example, a Carrera 2S 997 would be, albeit for the four-wheel drive system, be very similar to the 4S. You do get the wide body on the 4S does make a little bit of a difference, but essentially all the ergonomics of the car, the engine, and how they sound are the same. So it's quite a good, the two cars I've got are quite a good comparison of each other, comparing the 997 series Gen 2 to the 991 series Gen 1, because they both have the 3.8 litre flat 6 direct fuel injection, so DFI engines. The 997 has 385 horsepower headline. The later 991, which is what I'm in now, has 400 horsepower. Later on I'll have both of them parked up next to each other and I'll show you the physical differences, how they're similar, etc. Equipment wise, these two cars are very similar in terms of they have very similar options, and I'll go through that. But the key ones are is they both have the sports exhaust, they're both the 3.8, and they have Chrono, so they have Sport, Sport Plus, and PASM. Obviously PASM comes as standard on the S models, so this car has PASM, being a Carrera S or Carrera 2S. Now, this is my first 991 series car that I've had prepped for sale, so these are a new experience to me. I've very much been focusing on the 997 Gen 2 911s of late, and immediately it just feels more grown up. It feels bigger. It is physically bigger, and I'll go through that later on when they're parked up next to each other. But basically, it feels bigger in the cabin. The dashboard design and everything has been updated, and also the characteristics of how the engine drives have been updated. Both the cars I've got are the PDK, so again that's the same box in both, but how the car applies power is totally different, and it's almost the same sort of jump that I've seen between the 987 Gen 2 Cayman and the 981 Cayman, and the same with the 987 Boxster and the 981 Boxster. During that period of 2011-2012, they really made a huge sort of shift to making the cars immediately more accessible. They also moved to electrical powered steering. So this is the first generation with electrical steering. It is actually very good. It weights up nicely at speed. But one of the big differences I've noticed immediately is the character. They've tried to make this car sound more exciting. So even though both cars have the sports exhaust, the sports exhaust on this car is, I don't know, more exciting. It's more showy. And I'll just do it now, just while it's in neutral here, just well away from anyone else, so I'm not being antisocial to anyone who lives nearby or anything. But I'll do the same in the 997 as well when I get into that one later on in this video. Basically, it cackles and pops just like the Caymans do. They've engineered extra aural sound into that exhaust, whereas the 997 system is what I would call a traditional sports exhaust system, where it basically opens up extra freer flowing channels for some of the emissions to bypass the rear silencers. On this, it's actually, with the Sport button, with Sport Plus, it actually gets more and more ferocious for a given speed, for a given revs, and that's clearly being engineered whether they're dropping fuel into it. I haven't looked into the technology itself, but it just sounds on another level more exciting with the exhaust on. And I've got it on now. Sport Plus, it sounds even more aggressive and loud. Just waiting for some traffic. Our lanes around here are very narrow, so you have to kind of give way to people. But they're great because generally they're very, very quiet as well. That's the noises that you can achieve in the 991. So the downshifts are vocalised with spits and cackles, with the exhaust on. With the exhaust off, all of that just disappears. So it's quite nice. You get that ability to either have quite a docile but fast car, or quite a loud theatrical car, depending on whatever mood you're in. So for that reason, I love this car. Also, the way that this car handles with the 20-inch wheels versus the 19s on the 997, it feels that more planted. I don't think it suffers tramlining any more so than the 997 does. I think they've engineered the suspension to cope with that bigger size wheel very well. And as standard, I think these come with 19s, so but the 20s are not at the detriment. You still have a decent enough sidewall to absorb any bumps as long as you've got decent tyres. This car's got Pirelli P0s N-rated, so they're perfectly well suited to the car, the roads, for driving fast and in all conditions as well. Now the PDK Box works the same in both cars, so you have the same modes. You have normal modes, Sport and Sport Plus, and the way it changes gears changes in each of those modes. With Sport Plus basically holding the gears all the way to the red line, downshifting aggressively, whereas normal modes, without any of the buttons pressed, essentially it does adapt. It adapts to how you're reacting to using the throttle and how aggressively you're driving, but basically it can be very docile if you want it to be. And the same goes for in the 997, the two of them have that same sort of intelligence and intuitiveness to the system. The big recommendation, and both of them have it, is the sport design wheel. So you get these paddles, so you can change gear at the flick of a paddle, and there's one side is to shift down, the left one, and the right hand side paddle is to shift up. So there's no confusion. You're not going to get confused going around the corner which button you should be pressing to change gear manually. And likewise, you can shift to full manual mode there, or you could just leave it in auto but use the paddles auto, and essentially it's in manual mode as well. The way that they handle is, both are exceptional cars handling wise, but as I said, the 991 just feels even more planted. It does feel that little bit bigger because it just feels that little bit more intimidating on narrow roads like the ones I'm driving on now. So you have to be a bit more spatially aware in this car. The 997 was essentially the last car in the 991 range to be sort of svelte and streamlined, and this feels that little bit more bulkier, and size wise it is that slightly bit wider. It's slightly longer. The wheelbase is actually quite a bit longer. I believe it's 10 centimetres longer in wheelbase, but the actual length of the car is only 4 centimetres longer, so they've actually tucked the wheels further into the corners of the body. Jeez, that car was close. So it's just, and that's why I started off by saying it's essentially, it feels more grown up, it feels bigger, it feels more adult, but at the same time it has that excitement factor, which, although it's engineered, it doesn't lack anything versus 997. If anything, I would say that the 991, it does feel like a completely new generation, which obviously it should do. The weight is very similar, even though it's a bigger car, and that's through the use of some very intelligent use of alloy composites and things, which I'll go into detail when we have the cars parked up next to each other. But essentially the whole car is updated. It still looks like a 911, it still has the sound of a 911, but they've made such leap forwards in everything. And that's not to say that the 997, that makes the 997 a bad car, and when I drive it, I'm sure I'm still going to enjoy driving a 997, but it's just a very different experience. And now that these cars are sort of overlapping in price, so you can get a 2S 991 for around the same price as a 4S 997, and also the same goes for, you can get a 2S 997 Gen 2 for about the same price as a 991 Carrera, which is the 3.4. So they're overlapping now. So a lot of people are going to be thinking, well, do I maybe spend a little bit more? And it's only a few £1,000s. It's a couple of £1,000s, and you can get yourself into a 991, which is the newer generation. It's got bits of technology which bring it up to date more so than the 997 Gen 2. Or do I stick with the more classic designed, classic feel, hydraulic steering experience of the 997 Gen 2? And that's what this video is about. It's basically talking about which would you want for different circumstances. So next I'm going to get in the 997 and talk about how that one drives versus this lovely 991 Carrera S. I'm here now in the 997 Carrera 4S, and sitting behind the wheel, everything is exactly where it should be, just like it is in the 991. They have the same optional steering wheel, the sport design steering wheel with the paddles. They both have the PDK box. They both have all the sports options, so Sport Plus. They have PASM as standard, both of them. They both have the optional sports exhaust. So there's a huge amount of similarities in how these were spec'd up from the factory, but how they drive is very different. It was a huge step forward. This is a 2009, so this is, as I said, a Gen 2 997. So it has the later 3.8 DFI engine, which essentially is the same engine as in the 991. But how they talk to you and talk to the road is very different, because, as I mentioned in this video earlier, the 991 is slightly wider, it's slightly lower, but it's also crucially 10 centimetres longer in wheelbase. Only 4 centimetres longer in overall length of car, but the wheelbase is 10 centimetres longer, which means great job in bringing in the electrically assisted steering, in still allowing a level of communication with the driver, but nothing can really sort of compare with a hydraulically linked steering system. So that's the one huge difference between the two. Also, the 991 feels that little bit bulkier, it feels a little bit wider, a little bit more cumbersome on narrow roads. This feels like it wraps around you like a glove, so you feel, you know exactly where it is on the road, so you can drive it more confidently at speed on the narrower roads. And in all honesty, as a driver on dry roads, you don't notice a huge difference between whether a car's got the four-wheel drive system like this one, the 4S, or if it has the two-wheel drive system like the 991 does in the Carrera S, because there is only 5% of torque put through the front wheels in normal situations, and it diverts up to 40% of torque from the engine to the front wheels when it senses that there's a loss of grip. But the brakes are fantastic on this. The gear change response is the same in both cars. I would say that the sports exhaust option on the 991 is more theatrical. I think that's the word. This one, it is just adds a higher level of exhaust sound. It doesn't add pops and cackles like the 991 does. It just basically elevates the overall sound. It doesn't make it more drony particularly, but it does make it more tuneful at the higher revs. So I would say that the 991 sports exhaust option does sound more exciting. In isolation, both cars are sensational. The 991 does feel more modern inside. Behind the wheel, it feels like a grown-up version of the 911 compared to this. This feels a bit more old school, and that isn't a bad thing, but it's just, what do you prefer? And with these being so close in price now, you have to sort of assess, what do you prioritise? Do you prioritise that analog driving experience, or do you want the all-rounder, the all singing, all dancing, or basically all-round performer in the 991, or do you want something that does sort of feel like an older generation 911 with that sort of styling shape of that is unmistakable 911 in the 997? Because the 997 is essentially where the 911 shape transformed into this bigger, more up-to-date, safer shape. The 997 is the last one that sort of very clearly has ties with cars like the 993 in the angle of the headlights, the shape of the headlights. For me, the 991 sort of started exaggerating the 911 styling, so the headlights are more pronounced, they're more oval, they stick out more, the arches are wider, bigger, they look more imposing, and everything about the 991 is an exaggeration of the 911 style. When you think back to the first 911s of the 60s, they were very sort of dainty, quaint, styled more for purpose, and this 997 is sort of the last of that. Yes, of course it grew in size and grew in practicality, but the essence of that early 911 is very clear to see in this 997, and that's why the prices of these are on par with the 991. The 991 has sort of dropped to a level similar to the 997s, and I have a feeling that the 997s are always going to be revered, especially in these Gen 2 forms. And is still a phenomenal, great car. It's just a different proposition to this one. And I guess that's where I'm going to leave it, is basically say the two of them are so great at what they do that it doesn't really matter which one you want or which one you buy. One's not better than the other, they're just different. I just love being behind the wheel of the 997. There's so much feedback through the wheel, through the seats. The brakes are phenomenal. They're not over servoed. You can very quickly judge how much braking force to apply. So alive, so full of energy. It could just be so aggressive when you want it to be. I mean, this is running in Sport now. I've also been running it in Sport Plus. Sport is probably my preferred mode for this car. On the roads, on the circuit, obviously it'll be different. But as soon as it's up to temperature, the oil temperature's up to 95 degrees. Just gets more talkative, the engine just gets more talkative, the gearbox just works so sensational with this 3.8, 400 horsepower engine, flat 6 obviously, normally aspirated. If this was the last of the normally aspirated Carreras, they brought in the turbocharged 3 litre after this. So this is the most up-to-date body shell with normally aspirated engine, and it works fantastically even with the PDK system. It's just, everything is just in combination, it just syncs. And in isolation you wouldn't be disappointed to have this car as your only exciting, fun sports car, and it's perfectly usable as an everyday car too. It's got a very decent sized front boot, it's got decent sized rear seats, and yeah, just incredibly livable. Being my first 991, I don't think it's going to be my last. I'm completely sold on the idea. I think for now I'm going to stick to the non-turbocharged cars. I like that historic link with a flat 6 without a turbo on a Carrera and a Carrera S. For me, that is what this lineage is about. It's not about turbocharging for me. If you want a turbocharged 911, buy a 911 turbo, they're fantastic. I know it's obviously to accommodate and comply with emissions laws, bringing in the turbocharging, but for me it loses the character, it loses this sound. The natural flat 6 with no muting from strapping them through the exhaust through turbochargers just makes this car, and it makes so many sort of modern classic cars as well, not just the Porsches. And I wouldn't change the format of this car in any way. Just open the sunroof now as well. two cars. This is actually a 997 Gen 1.5 turbo. It's not a 4S. The 4S I wanted to use to compare the interiors is actually, it's already been sold. So I've got here the 991 Gen 1 2S. It's a Carrera S. The Gen 1.5 997 essentially has the same interior and layout on the inside as the Gen 2. So it has the same sat-nav and everything else. So I can show you very quickly. So this is a Tiptronic. So it has the Tiptronic box there. It has the standard seats, but they've got red stitching. Now you can see immediately that the cabin is obviously very nice. It's all covered in leather, but it does have a quite a low centre tunnel there, and then it has sort of like a almost vertical control panel there. Whereas the 991, just open that up. A bit like the, well, it is the same design as the 981 series Cayman and Boxers. It has this centre tunnel that goes up, so that would be the sort of the vertical. It has this sort of extension here with all the buttons, all the controls, and it sort of curves up to the sat-nav system, all the heating controls. So that design there, compared to the 997 series cars, just looks a little bit more cohesive. You've got a curve there. It's more of a driver orientated cockpit for that reason, for that gear, in this case the PDK being a bit closer to your hand to operate it. It has a sport design wheel there. They both have 5 dials here, but this one you essentially can vary. This one, it's an LCD panel, so you can change what you display there depending on what takes your fancy. Sport chrono, they both have sport chrono, so the stopwatch is also a clock on this car when it's not in use, whereas on the 997 shows 0. The seats, I'd say, are a little bit bigger at the back. They've actually got a lower piece. As standard, they came with Isofix as well. On 997s, you can only spec Isofix on the front passenger seat. You couldn't spec it in the back. But there are child options in the back of the 997 as well. Wing mirrors are also on the door on the 991. 997, they're actually as part of the sort of the window frame. Obviously they're still attached to the door when you open the window, but I mean they're not actually on the door panel like the 991 version. And then front boots. So there's the 991. So it has quite a big boot. All the tools are at the sides, out of the way. Your triangle's there, batteries there, but it's a bigger panel to lift up to have a look at that one. And then in the front of the 997, the 997 front, you have a bit of a smaller boot. This is obviously the 4-wheel drive, so it does encroach a tad, but all the tools are in the bottom there underneath a little piece of plastic lined with carpet. Batteries, that smaller panel there. So looking at that one, then looking at this one, I'd say that there's a little bit more practicality on the 991. Headlight shape, I'd say they've gone more, I guess the word's elliptical. So it's much more of a pronounced oval compared to the 997. They are actually bigger. They, as you can see, they stick out quite a way. They're quite rounded out, whereas on the 997, they're quite flat. Wheel size, 991s, they went to 19s as standard, 20s as the optional, so they're the 20s. With the 997, it was 19s or 18s. With the turbo, it was obviously 19s from standard. let me show you the rear boot. That's the rear engine bay. So the rear engine bay, okay, this is a turbo, so it has a different air intake and the feed across the sides there, but essentially you can still have access to looking at the engine. On the 991, the boot and the front and the rear engine hatch, these are the same, in the same place on both the 991 and 997. That's all you see. So you don't actually get to see any of the engine. For servicing, they do actually need to take off the rear bumper to access the engine bay, the actual engine, as it were. So as the consumer, as the owner of the car, you don't really get to see the engine. These are the replacement standard seats, but actually they're called sport seats. And then the ones with the hard backs, which were called sport seats on the 997, are called Sport Seats Plus on the 991. So just watch out for that when you read descriptions of that difference. The seals are an updated design, but they still have, as standard, a stainless steel inscription on a plastic edge. You can still specify a rear wiper if you wanted to, and also you could specify a larger sunroof. On later 991s they actually made this glass, but on this early one, 2012, it's got a steel roof. Just go back to the 997 again, just to show you that there's the Chrono Stopwatch, slightly different design, and also it doesn't function as anything other than a stopwatch when you've got the Chrono enabled. Steering wheels could essentially, you could have the same steering wheel you could have the sport design steering wheel in the 997s as well. So yeah, I mean they're the major similarities and differences between the 991, the 997 Gen 2 in terms of how they physically are different. The 991 is, as I've said on the driving section, it's got a 10 centimetre longer wheelbase, but it's only 4 centimetres longer in total length, which means that the wheels have essentially been tucked further into the corners. So there's less of an overhang. So there, looking at the 997, there's quite an overhang in front of that front wheel. And it's very hard to tell on the camera, but it's significantly less. I'd say it's definitely centimetres less. And the same with the rear as well. Let me do the rear. So there versus, I mean, this is very unscientific, but just looking at the dimensions differences, that's clearly been the big change. Brake wise, they also upgraded the brakes. I mean, these are the turbos, so they have big brakes anyway, but essentially the Carrera S has even larger setup there. Obviously it depends what model you get. I'm just trying to highlight the general differences. Obviously the headlight design and the whole styling of this car was updated compared to the 997. But you've got hopefully an idea of how they differ, how similar they are. So essentially, it was quite a big evolution for Porsche when they released the 991. It was a big sort of step forward in design, physical design and styling, but they both sort of are distinguishable in their own right, and also they are both clearly a 911. It doesn't mark a significant departure in styling, but they did make it physically bigger. They changed the ergonomics of the interior. They changed the technology underlying the car to basically just bring it up to date for that period in time. So that you have things like Bluetooth audio streaming rather than just Bluetooth for phone. So it will allow you to basically access music from your phone, just like on the 981 Caymans and Boxsters. All of that technology was updated in 2012 to make it comparable with the competition at the time. Obviously now it's gone a step further, and now you've got CarPlay enabled cars. You've got cars that basically replicate your phone's apps on the screen of the car and lets you integrate a lot of what you do on your phone with the car, which is good. I mean, some people see it as good, some people see it as bad. There's more distractions, there's more things to sort of take your attention away from the fact that you're in a fabulous 911 or generally a Porsche. So there's the comparison. If you like this video, please click the like button, put a comment in if you have any questions, and obviously subscribe to my channel if you want to see more Porsche content of cars that I have in stock, cars that I look at in detail, and yeah, just basically give a bit more of an insight into what these Porsche are all about. Thank you for watching.